Robin Grille is a psychologist, educator and author of 2 parenting books. Let's hear how our treatment of children can affect the fate of the world. Please welcome Robin to the TEDxPittwater stage.
Thank you. Oh, went too far. Okay. Think of a world without war, a world of social justice, a world of ecological sustainability. And what if that was entirely attainable? It depends on how we treat children. Well, the new sciences of child development have undergone a revolution in recent years, and what's been uncovered is a peace potential encoded in the neurology of every child, waiting outside input. So how do we unlock this peace code in the human brain and help it to find its fullest expression? First of all, what do you believe about human violence? Are we destined to be violent creatures because our genes told us so? Or is perhaps our violence a reaction to our environment? Modern neuroscience has shed new light on this question, and the implications are very clear and interesting. To begin with, there's no gene holding a smoking gun for violent behaviour. And in fact, our genes don't preordain our personality traits, not in the way that was once thought. New science of epigenetics says this: the world that surrounds a child changes the way that child's genes are expressed. So that in early childhood, the relationships around us redraft our genetic code by causing some of our genes to be switched on, other genes to be switched off. Consider this: no human individual was ever born genetically predetermined to lead a life of violence. That influences our behaviour for life. Now, the brain of a child grows according to how that child is treated. So that in an empathic environment, the brain of this child grows in one way, but in an environment that is harsh, punitive and cold, the same child's brain would grow quite differently. So our early childhood relationships change our brain. They shape our behaviour, and that's how we create the kind of societies we're going to have. So where are these centres for peace in the human brain? We have specialised empathy centres in our brains, at least 10 of them. Also, our brains are endowed with mirror neurons that help us to resonate with how other people feel. In the critical stages of early childhood, these empathy centres in our brain grow like muscles grow, through nourishment and use. So that when a child receives empathy, this grows new neural pathways in the brain's empathy centres. But when a child is frightened, neglected, their brain produces cortisol. This is a stress hormone, a natural process, but when the stress is chronic, unending, traumatic, shocking, the cortisol remains high. It becomes neurotoxic. It attacks and destroys brain cells in vast quantities in those areas of the brain devoted to emotional regulation, impulse control. So that children that have been heavily abused and neglected have large areas of the cortex and the prefrontal lobes atrophied or missing. What's recognised today is that chronic violence and impulsivity in adults is a response to this kind of emotional brain damage from childhood. This is a game changer. The violence of history is symptomatic of large-scale child abuse and neglect. Remember this: violence is a preventable brain disorder. What a new way to think about it. You may have also heard about oxytocin by now, the hormone of love. When a parent does what comes natural, loving and pleasurable with their child, the parent's brain and the child's brain secrete oxytocin. This feels wonderful. It helps us to feel closer to one another. but there's a double whammy. Oxytocin is a fertilizer. It's a brain nutrient. It generates the growth of new neural pathways in those brain regions devoted to emotional regulation, impulse control. So that the love and affection of a parent is literally growing the empathy centers of the child's brain. It adds mass there. Parents, grandparents, teachers, we are the empathy farmers for the next generation. Get that? So whether you lead a life of violence or a life of empathy has so much to do with childhood experience. But if violence has its roots in childhood, why is it that human history is so terribly marred by violence at every page? Does that mean that too many of history's children were traumatized? And the answer to that is shockingly yes. And here's an aspect of history they did not talk about in school. In all the early civilizations, in every continent, children were used as slaves. They were used as temple prostitutes. They were severely beaten. The law of the time permitted parents to kill or abandon their own unwanted children at a rate of up to 2 out of 5. It was widely condoned for children to be used as sexual playthings. The practice of ritual mutilation of children's bodies, widespread in many cultures around the world, elongation of the skull, scarifying of the flesh, foot binding, circumcision, etc. Middle Ages, Renaissance, parents were still abandoning their children by their millions. Every town in Europe was forced to build a foundling home to take them in. So appalling were the conditions in these homes, survival rates were sometimes down to 10%. Child beating was so severe, what we today call child abuse was then called good parenting. Mothers who could afford it, middle classes and nobility, refused to feed their own babies. This was farmed out to professional wet nurses. Industrial Revolution. Things did not improve much. Children as young as 4 were forced to work as chimney sweeps, in the mines, coal mines, textile mills, factories. So for centuries and millennia, childhood for many was a brutish, if not a hellish experience. Think of the scale of the traumatization and of the epigenetic and neurological damage done. When so many children are treated like this, how would you expect them to behave when they grow up? Is it any wonder that human history is so fraught with war and dictatorship? And that's why when you read history, you're likely to get a very skewed first impression about human nature. Okay, so let's skip to the present and see what happens for a nation that takes a leap forward in child rearing reform. Sweden, first country in the world to ban corporal punishment of children, first country to make all of its labour wards fully baby-friendly hospital compliant, which means they support breastfeeding very well, and that's why they have a much higher breastfeeding rate than Australia and the United States. A Swedish mother is generously paid to stay with her infant for 18 months. You're not allowed to advertise to children there, under 12. Important. What did these child rearing reforms produce for Sweden later? Let's take a look. Steady drops in child abuse, drops in youth crime and substance abuse, the lowest homicide rate in the world. Government there has committed to zero use of fossil fuels by 2020, and they're halfway there already. Sweden has the highest gender equality on earth. They're always in the top 10 for the Global Peace Index and the Sustainability Index, third least corrupt country, the fourth most democratic country, and by a number of surveys, the second happiest country in the world. So as you can see, the Swedes are less violent towards one another now, but they're also less violent towards a natural environment. Here's the important thing to get though. The same and much better could be accomplished in any nation that commits itself to supporting that most important work of all, the work of parents, grandparents and teachers. Now, in the 20th century, some massive strides were taken to end the misery of childhood. Most nations around the world began to legislate against child labour and to guarantee free and universal education. The first child protection laws began to proliferate early in the century, and then in 1962, an American paediatrician first coined the term, the battered child syndrome. That's when the world began to take child abuse seriously and to tackle the issue. Up until then, child abuse was not deemed important enough to think about. The concept of children's rights, invented in the 1980s, and today all but 2 of the world's nations have signed on to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. Corporal punishment, fast disappearing from the world, illegal in the schools of 120 nations, illegal at home for 39 nations, with 47 more nations working on this ban. So, it seems like we are learning to make peace with childhood. Think about it, more oxytocin, less cortisol in the mix. The war of history is about a predominance of societies that have child-rearing styles predominantly that are high cortisol, low oxytocin. We're moving towards high oxytocin, low cortisol parenting. You now know what that does to the brain, how it changes it. Has this begun to create a more peaceful world? Let's take a look. For the first time in human history, laws began to proliferate, enshrining equal rights for the genders and protecting ethnic and sexual minorities from vilification and discrimination. And more than ever, nations have a basic safety net for the vulnerable, the old, the impoverished and the disabled. Now, of course, there's much more work to be done in the area of social justice, but there can be no denying that giant strides were taken in the 20th century. Today, 140 nations hold multi-party elections. For the first time ever, democracies outnumber dictatorships. This is a radical discontinuity from the iron-fisted rulers of the past. There's never been democratisation on such a scale. There are now over 2 million non-government organisations around the world working very hard to protect the rights of the vulnerable. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch are just 2 of the better known examples. And in fact, the concept of a universal code of human rights, that was only enshrined as recently as 1948. And believe it or not, despite 2 world wars, the average war-related mortality in the modern world has plummeted to 0.3%. Of course, that's still absolutely unacceptable, but compare this to the 10% of 200 years ago and the 25% of antiquity. United Nations peacekeeping forces today have managed to reduce civil war recidivism by 80%. On average around the world, violent crime and even domestic violence has been plummeting, and the rates even continue to fall during the recent global financial crisis. Today, the concept, the idea of a violent revolution is starting to be passé. Heroes are more likely to be Aung San Suu Kyi, Mandela, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and the principles of non-violent protest and boycott are gaining traction. We call this a force more powerful. And so you can see that the vast child rearing reforms of the 20th century have already begun to yield massive dividends to humanity. And this should encourage us to continue with this agenda of child rearing reform, because there's still such a long way to go to reduce human-to-human violence, but also to cease our violence towards the natural world. Our very survival depends on that. So, how do we stimulate a deeper emergence of this peace code in the human brain? I want to propose a 7-point social policy initiative designed to be supportive of families, supportive of children. And each of these 7 points is backed by a large body of international research. It's already been tried and tested extensively overseas, found to be revenue neutral, but often also beneficial to national budgets in areas of crime, health, and academic performance. So, drum roll to begin with, generously paid parental leave for at least 18 months, as is so successfully done already in Northern European nations. All of our research makes it very clear babies do much better for the long term when allowed to remain close with their families. We need increased support, number 2, for early intervention initiatives that bring attachment-oriented education and support to all new parents, especially in disadvantaged populations. 3, we need maternity hospitals to place more practical emphasis on the psychological needs of mothers, fathers, and their newborns. This would mean accelerating the already existing movement towards natural birth away from the medicalisation of birth, because there are proven positive behavioural benefits for the baby's lifespan. 4, we need more support for full-term breastfeeding. Apart from the well-understood health and immunological benefits, breastfeeding brings that high oxytocin that enlarges the empathy centres of the child's brain. 5, prohibit all corporal punishment of children at school and at home, as backed by mountains of international research and as mandated by Article 19 of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. Number 6, end all advertising that targets children. Children are persons, they're not a market to be exploited. Number 7, last but by no means least, we need to proliferate the use of emergent curriculum in schools, decentralising standards of education and allowing children to learn according to the pursuit of their personal passions. This is the educational method that enabled the schools of Finland to be the most successful schools in the world. And as the newest educational philosophy, backed by oodles of research, it's also brought about sharp reductions in school bullying, school violence in many countries around the world. So, this peace code in the human brain, it lives in the brain's empathy centres. It's hardwired there as a potentiality, awaiting the right input from the outside so that it can grow to full maturity. A new and more harmonious society begins where it begins at home, it begins at school, but it begins with a collective willingness to give the necessary support to parents, grandparents, and teachers. We're living now in turning point times when humanity is learning to understand ourselves in a whole new way. The new sciences of child development have decoded a new program by which we can create societies that are better adapted to peaceful global citizenship and a sustainable partnership with planet Earth. To put it simply, change childhood and the world will change too. Thank you.